everybody. Welcome back. Today's episode is going to be on how I build the table. So I'm going to be kind of watching myself build the table and narrating it, kind of like Mystery Space Theater type thing. It's a video on the basics of how I build tables. 6 hours of footage, and it's like I gotta try and condense this in 4 minutes. First thing I do is I pick out the boards. Luckily for me, I had boards already picked out. I just had to cut them to a rough length. Whenever I do epoxy, I always just save my extra epoxy in boards. That way I have them for later. So I had these older boards with lots of purple epoxy. And I like the purple epoxy. Then I went around and I had to pick out other boards for the rest of the parts of the table, such as legs and rails. And since I am a tight-ass Pollock, I don't like wasting wood, so I look through all of my scrap. And I try to find nasty boards because for me it's a challenge in how to fix those boards. They always usually turn out better. Usually. Yeah. So then once I had all my boards, I usually trim one end, cut them to a rough length. I cut them to a rough length. So if the legs have to be 18 inches, I usually cut them to 19 inches because I like having some screw up room. Then after I cut my boards to length, I usually flatten the side and join an edge. If I don't have to flatten anything, I just usually join it so I can send it through the table saw without it binding. I tried to get away with it and I bind. So I had to put it through everything. Because I have a 13-inch planer, so putting a wide board through it isn't always done well. So I try to cut off as much excess as I possibly can. Once I have everything pretty flat, then I cut it to the finished length. After everything's cut, I decide to work on the top first. The top's always the most prettiest, if that's a correct, proper phrase. And since the rest of the table size is dictated by how big the top is, usually for me anyways, I decided to do the top first because that's the only part I had to glue. I wanted to see what looked good, what orientation I wanted the boards in. I needed to alternate my grain, and also to see if there was any little gaps. So I double checked everything before I started gluing it, before I put the biscuits in. I don't like gaps. And then for me, I like biscuits. I would say biscuits and dowels are my most fun. I would say biscuits and dowels are my favorite. So whenever I do a top, usually no matter how small, I usually always put biscuits. Sometimes I don't, depending on the size of the board, but I like biscuits just because for me, it's easier to line everything up. I don't always use nice straight boards. I spent time measuring it too, and I still screwed it up. I wanted to glue everything up first, then I could work on the legs and the rails, because the glue takes a little time to set. I always put too much glue on, but it's easier to wipe off excess glue than it is to squirt more glue in. Once that was dry, wow, crazy eyes, sorry. Once the top was assembled and clamped, I started working on the curves for the rails and the legs. You can see me struggling on it. It's hard to do it one-handed, so I have a little board with a rope on it and I try to pee with it that way. Usually when I get one nice curve drawn in, I cut it out, sand it, make it pretty, because then I use that as a template for everything else. And I only have to fart around drawing the curve once for several boards. Oh, look at me go, look at me go. Then for this little table, I attach it with pocket screws. I use the Craig jig. Craig jig. And I assemble everything because sometimes I'll get a piece of wood that cracks, or if I have to use clamps, I'm going to get clamp marks on it, or if I have to put a pencil line on it. It's all done before sanding, so I don't have to worry about being too nice to the boards. I can assemble it, see if there's anything I screwed up, and I'm not out any time because I had to sand everything. So I usually do an assembly prior to finish, even prior to routing. So I usually assemble it, then once it looks good, I'll do other things to it. Like over here, I'm routing all of my table legs. I want my table legs rounded. I also round over the tabletop, and then I put a chamfer on the tabletop. The only problem I had with my legs is they were oak. I hate oak. Red oak. It's like the vanilla of wood species. It's like if you get any more boring color and oak. It's like, what kind of ice cream do you want? Vanilla. What do you want your table made out of? Oak. I had oak, so I used oak. This was an experiment for me anyways. Judge me, monkey. Clamps come in really handy. If you have a couple of clamps, buy yourself a couple of more. It's like having friends in high school. You always think more is better, but clamps really are more is better. Or in Wisconsin, more is gooder. My favorite thing to do is I have an adjustable square. Once I figure out what I have my reveal at, or how far in I want my rails for my legs, I set my adjustable square up so I don't have to measure every time. I usually tell people I'm just lazy, but in real life I'm efficient. I don't want to sit there with a tape measure and try and figure out, is it on this line or this line? So that's why I use an adjustable square. If it's touching the square, that's where it goes. If it's not touching the square, it's not in the right place. And then of course, using clamps, being the professional woodworker that I am, I had one that shifted like an 1/8 inch on me. It was just trash. No matter what I did, it went back in the same stupid hole. I'm starting the finishing process. I didn't show you the sanding part because, like, for God's sakes, you know what sanding looks like. But I cut some grooves in all of my legs because they had some defects in them, and I thought, hey, how can I make this simple table more complicated? Let's do epoxy. The epoxy made the project about 40 to 50% longer to do. With red oak, it's very porous. If I put epoxy on red oak, it usually absorbs into pores and then it kind of stains the wood. So I put some polyurethane on first to hopefully block the absorption of the colored epoxy. Didn't do anything really because I screwed everything up horribly. And I had to do the epoxy pour twice because I got lazy and I used painter's tape where I should have used house wrap tape or something else. And it leaked all over, and I had to put some epoxy in the top just because it wasn't all the way through and I wanted a solid top. Solid top. So I did some more epoxy on the top. I kept the whole purple theme going. I thought I did such a good job on the epoxy too. I'm doing it. Oh, I'm the best woodworker in the world, man. It's gonna look great. So that put me a good hour behind. When you fail at life, cover your mistakes with epoxy. Then of course you finish sand everything because I know it's gonna fit. So I don't have to worry about assembling it. So I can just worry about sanding it. And then when you do several epoxy pours to cover mistakes up, you have a lot of sanding to do. I didn't go crazy with the sanding. I only went up to 220 grit. I decided not to use polyurethane this time. I have a 1-coat oil, all natural, oil-based stain / protectant. It's meant for hardwood floor. Put it on, let it sit for 15 minutes, put on a second coat, then about 15-20 minutes you wipe it all down. It gives it more of a satiny matte look. I'm not 100% in love with it. It does make the epoxy shine a little bit without polyurethane. It's expensive as but I used that just to experiment on it and try it out. It worked well. I'm still playing with it, not sure if I'm in love with it. The top looks good though. Oh my God. The top looks so good. It's my favorite part about the whole thing, the top. The legs suck. Top looks good. As I'm assembling everything, it's completely done. You can see in the background, my top fell off the counter. And I swore a lot that time. I swore a lot. And then the table was all done. Turned out nice. I like the top. The legs don't seem to go very well with it. That's the step-by-step way of how I build a very basic table. Hope you learned something. If you didn't, sorry. Thanks for watching like you always do. We'll see you next time. Bye everybody.